The sleek Maserati wove through the winding roads of the Hamptons, its engine purring beneath the expert control of Maxwell Reed. At 45, Max had conquered Wall Street, amassed a fortune that most could only dream of, and built Titan Enterprises into one of America's most formidable investment firms. The late afternoon sun glinted off his platinum watch as he navigated the familiar route to his waterfront estate, his mind already calculating his next acquisition. "Eleanor will understand," he muttered to himself, rehearsing the conversation he would have with his fiancée about cancelling their weekend plans yet again. Another deal was brewing, one that would add another jewel to his crown of achievements. Eleanor Lawrence, former fashion model and his partner of 3 years, had been increasingly vocal about his workaholic tendencies, but business waited for no one, and Max had built his empire on that very principle. His phone rang through the car's speakers. "Max, the board needs those projections tonight," his executive assistant reminded him. "Already sent them," Max replied confidently. "Tell Jenkins to check his inbox. I've also included the Singapore portfolio analysis he asked for." Always. 3 steps ahead. That was Maxwell Reed's trademark. Control was his addiction and success his drug of choice. He ended the call with a satisfied smile. Nothing could touch him. Nothing could slow him down, until everything did. The deer appeared suddenly, bounding onto the road from the dense forest that lined the private drive. Max swerved instinctively, a split-second decision that sent the Maserati careening off. The asphalt. The world spun in a kaleidoscope of green trees and blue sky before a deafening crash silenced everything. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments, searing pain, the taste of blood, the distant wail of sirens. The paramedic spoke in urgent tones as they stabilized his neck and lifted him onto a stretcher. He tried to move but found his body unresponsive to his commands. "Sir, try not to move," a female paramedic instructed, her face appearing above him, haloed by the evening sun. "You've been in a serious accident." The world faded again, giving way to the sterile brightness of hospital corridors, the urgent voices of medical personnel, and finally, the grave face of a neurosurgeon standing at the foot of his bed. "Mr. Reed, I'm Dr. Harrington," the surgeon began, his voice measured. "The impact from your accident has caused significant trauma to your spinal cord. We've done everything possible, but there's severe damage at the T10 vertebra." Max stared at him, the words washing over him without fully registering. "What are you saying?" he managed, his voice a rasp. "I'm saying that you're experiencing paraplegia, paralysis from the waist down. With intensive rehabilitation, you may regain some function, but you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this condition could be permanent." The pronouncement hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Max felt his world constrict, crushing inward until breathing itself seemed an impossible task. He who had commanded boardrooms and bent markets to his will now lay powerless, his body a traitor to his commands. The days that followed blurred into a haze of tests, consultations, and medications that dulled his physical pain, but did nothing for the grief that had taken root in his soul. Eleanor visited, her perfect features arranged in an expression of sympathy that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Darling, you look better today," she said, placing a bouquet of lilies on the windowsill but not touching him. The distance between them, once a comfortable space that accommodated their independent lifestyles, now felt like a chasm. "The doctors say I'll need extensive rehabilitation," Max told her, watching her reaction carefully. "They've recommended a facility in New Haven." Eleanor nodded, her gaze drifting to the window. "I've been thinking about that. Your penthouse isn't exactly equipped for this situation." She gestured vaguely towards his immobile legs. "And I'm not. I mean, we need to be practical." "Practical," Max repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. "I've looked into professional caregivers," Eleanor continued, scrolling through her phone. "There's an agency that specializes in cases like yours. They provide round-the-clock care. I think it's the best solution." What she didn't say was just as telling, that she wasn't prepared to be that caregiver, that the man she had agreed to marry was now different, damaged, dependent. The realization cut deeper than any physical pain he had endured. "I see," was all he could manage. Eleanor stayed for exactly 27 minutes. He timed it on the wall clock before making an excuse about a charity event she couldn't miss. She kissed his cheek, promised to return tomorrow, and left a cloud of expensive perfume in her wake. Once she was gone, Max allowed himself to feel the full weight of his new reality. His body, once an instrument of his will, had become his prison. The empire he had built, the wealth he had accumulated, the power he had wielded, none of it could fix what was broken. For the first time in his adult life, Maxwell Reed was utterly helpless. 3 weeks later, Max was discharged from the hospital and transferred to Ocean View Rehabilitation Center in New Haven, Connecticut. The facility was top tier, as befitted his status and wealth, but to Max it represented a humiliating descent from the heights he had occupied. His room overlooked Long Island Sound, a view that once would have impressed him, but now only reminded him of the sailing trips he might never take again. Physical therapy sessions were excruciating exercises in frustration, each minute effort that once would have been unconsciously simple, now required monumental concentration and yielded minimal results. His therapist, a relentlessly positive man named Roger, praised improvements that seemed insignificant to Max, who had always measured success on a grander scale. Eleanor's visits grew less frequent, her excuses more elaborate. Business trips, social obligations, and eventually the honest admission that she found it difficult to see him this way. Their conversations became stilted, focusing on managing his affairs rather than their relationship. "I've had your assistant set up a temporary office at the penthouse," she informed him during one visit. "I'll oversee Titan's operations while you're recovering." The implication was clear. She expected to take control, assuming his incapacity extended to his business acumen as well. Max felt a flare of the old fire, a determination not to be sidelined or pitied. "That won't be necessary," he said firmly. "I've arranged for video conferences with the board. My mind works perfectly fine, Eleanor. I'm not an invalid." She looked surprised, then slightly annoyed. "Max, be reasonable. You need to focus on your recovery. The company can manage without your direct involvement for a while." "It's not up for discussion," he replied, his tone final. It was a small act of defiance, but it felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. After 6 weeks at Ocean View, with minimal progress in physical function, but having reached a plateau in his rehabilitation program, Max made the decision to return to his penthouse in Manhattan. Against medical advice, but with his considerable resources enabling the necessary accommodations, arrangements were made. The day before his departure, the facility director, Dr. Mitchell, visited his room. "Mr. Reed, I understand your decision, but I want to emphasize the importance of continuing your rehabilitation. We've arranged for a home care team to assist you, including a full-time specialized caregiver." Max nodded absently, his attention on the emails flooding his tablet. He had already interviewed and rejected 3 potential caregivers, finding them either intimidated by his status or patronizing in their approach. "Her name is Sarah Mitchell, no relation to me," Dr. Mitchell continued with a small smile. "She's one of our best. Former rehabilitation nurse with specialized training in spinal cord injuries. She's also," he hesitated, "quite straightforward. I think you'll find she's different from the others you've met." "We'll see," Max replied non-committally. In his experience, people were predictable. They either wanted something from him or were intimidated by him. He expected this Sarah to be no different. How wrong he would be. Sarah Mitchell stood in the gleaming lobby of the Sovereign, one of Manhattan's most exclusive residential buildings, clutching her credentials and ignoring the doorman's skeptical gaze. At 34, with her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wearing simple scrubs beneath her coat, she didn't fit the typical visitor profile for this temple of wealth. "Mr. Reed is expecting me," she said firmly. "I'm his new caregiver." The doorman's expression shifted subtly as he made the connection. Everyone in New York's upper circles had heard about Maxwell Reed's accident, the mighty titan of finance brought low by cruel fate. It had been fodder for gossip, columns for weeks. Of course, Penthouse A. Mr. Reed's assistant left instructions for your arrival. The private elevator whisked Sarah upward, giving her a moment to collect her thoughts. She had read Maxwell Reed's medical file thoroughly and knew the challenges ahead. A T10 spinal cord injury, incomplete but with minimal voluntary function, below the injury site, complications from associated trauma, and psychological adjustment issues flagged by the rehabilitation center staff. What the clinical notes didn't capture was the man's reputation. Brilliant, ruthless, demanding, and now, according to her colleague at Ocean View, bitter and difficult. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse foyer, where a sharp-featured woman in a designer dress waited, tapping her foot impatiently. "You must be Sarah. I'm Eleanor Lawrence, Max's fiancée," she said, not offering her hand. "I have a luncheon at the Met that I simply cannot miss, so I'll be brief. Max's condition has been challenging. He requires assistance with daily functions, medication management, physical therapy routines, all detailed in this binder." She thrust a leather portfolio towards Sarah. "The household staff comes 3 times weekly. They don't interact with Max. That will be your responsibility." Sarah accepted the binder, her professional smile not wavering despite the woman's cold demeanor. "I understand. Would you like to introduce me to Mr. Reed before you leave?" Eleanor glanced at her watch. "He's in the study. Second door on the right. He knows you're coming." She gathered her purse and coat. "One more thing. Max can be difficult. Don't take it personally." With that parting wisdom, Eleanor swept into the elevator, leaving Sarah alone in the vast, sterile perfection of the penthouse. Everything gleamed with wealth. The marble floors, the museum-quality art, the panoramic views of Central Park. Yet the space felt hollow, unlived in, more showcase than home. Sarah took a deep breath and made her way to the study. She knocked, once before entering, finding Maxwell Reed behind an imposing desk that had been modified to accommodate his wheelchair. He didn't look up from his computer. "Mr. Reed, I'm Sarah Mitchell, your new caregiver." Maxwell finally looked up, his steel-gray eyes assessing her with the cold calculation that had made him famous in business circles. At first glance, he was still every inch the powerful executive. Perfectly tailored shirt, strong jawline, commanding presence. Only the wheelchair and the subtle hollowness in his cheeks hinted at his ordeal. "You're younger than I expected," he said dismissively. "How many cases like mine have you handled?" 17 spinal cord injuries of varying levels over 8 years, 6 of them similar to yours, Sarah replied evenly. "Before that, I was an ICU nurse for 5 years. Would you like to see my credentials?" A flicker of surprise crossed his face at her direct response. He had clearly expected intimidation or deference. "That won't be necessary. Your predecessor lasted 3 days. The one before that, too. Are you aiming for a record?" Sarah set her bag down and met his gaze squarely. "I'm not here to break records, Mr. Reed. I'm here to help you regain as much independence as possible and to assist with what you can't do yet. Whether that's for 3 days or 3 years depends on whether we can work together effectively." Max leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "I don't need a babysitter or a cheerleader. I need competent, discreet assistance that doesn't interfere with my work. Can you provide that?" "I can, but I should be clear about something from the start," Sarah said, pulling up a chair without waiting for an invitation. "I'm not your employee in the traditional sense. I'm a healthcare professional with ethical obligations to your well-being that sometimes might conflict with what you want. If you're looking for someone to simply follow orders without question, I'm not that person." For a moment, she thought, she'd overplayed her hand. Maxwell Reed was a man accustomed to deference, and she had just laid down boundaries that few would dare establish with him. But then something unexpected happened. A brief smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, but softened his features nonetheless. "Honesty, refreshing," he said. "Fine, Ms. Mitchell, we'll try it your way. You'll find your quarters through that door." He gestured to a door at the side of the study. "I expect you to be available when needed, but not hovering. My physical therapy routine is in the morning. I handle my own business calls and meetings. I don't require conversation or pity. Are we clear?" "Crystal," Sarah replied, standing. "I'll get settled and then we'll review your medication schedule and therapy routine. Is there anything else you need right now?" "Yes, privacy." Sarah nodded and collected her bag. "I'll be back in 30 minutes to discuss your evening routine." As she turned to leave, Max spoke again. "Why did you take this job, Ms. Mitchell? Your credentials suggest you could work anywhere. Why choose to deal with a difficult patient in a private setting?" Sarah paused at the door. "Because sometimes the patients who push everyone away are the ones who need someone to stay the most." With that, she left him to his thoughts, closing the door quietly behind her. The suite assigned to her was luxurious by any standard, though notably separate from the main living areas, a physical reflection of the barrier Maxwell had erected between himself and those around him. Sarah unpacked quickly, arranged her medical supplies, and reviewed the detailed instructions left by the rehabilitation center. 30 minutes later, as promised, she returned to the study. Max was still at his desk, but now on a video call, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of a man used to commanding attention. "The Singapore expansion proceeds as planned," he was saying. "The market volatility gives us leverage in the negotiations. Tell Matthews to hold firm on our offer." Sarah waited quietly by the door until he finished the call, observing how he came alive when discussing business, how his isolation seemed to temporarily lift when engaged with the world he understood and controlled. "Your medication is due," she said when he disconnected, approaching with a small cup of pills and water. "And we should discuss your physical therapy schedule for tomorrow." Max accepted the medication without comment, then fixed her with an evaluating stare. "The last therapist insisted on twice-daily sessions. It was excessive and interfered with my work." "The recommended protocol is twice daily," Sarah confirmed, "but we can be flexible about timing to accommodate your schedule. What doesn't work is skipping sessions entirely. Consistency matters more than perfect adherence to a predefined schedule." She noticed the untouched lunch tray on a side table. "You haven't eaten." "I wasn't hungry. Nutrition affects recovery. Your body can't rebuild what you don't give it materials for," Sarah replied, her tone matter-of-fact rather than scolding. "Would you prefer something different than what was prepared?" Max looked momentarily surprised by the practical approach rather than a lecture. "I don't have much appetite these days. That's common with your medication regimen and situation. We can start with smaller portions of higher-calorie foods. What do you usually enjoy eating?" The simple question, focusing on preference rather than necessity, seemed to catch him off guard. "I used to like Italian food before all this." Sarah nodded. "I'll speak with your chef. For now, would you try the soup at least? It's important with your evening medication." To her surprise, Max wheeled himself over to the tray and made an effort with the soup. As he ate, Sarah noticed the subtle tremor in his hand, a sign of the medications or perhaps something deeper. "Tell me about your rehabilitation goals," she said, keeping her tone conversational rather than clinical. "Beyond what's in the medical file." Max paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. "My goal is to return to my life as it was, to walk into my boardroom again and watch my competitors' faces when they realize they've underestimated me again." Sarah nodded. "That's a powerful motivator. And in the meantime, what about day-to-day goals?" "There is no meantime," Max replied sharply. "This is temporary, a detour, not a destination." The denial was textbook, but Sarah knew better than to challenge it directly. "Fair enough, but recovery is a journey that happens one day at a time. What would make tomorrow better than today?" Max set down his spoon, his expression hardening. "What would make tomorrow better is not having to justify my existence or be reminded of my limitations at every turn. What would make tomorrow better is being treated like a man, not a medical case." The raw emotion in his voice caught Sarah off guard. Beneath the sophisticated exterior and defensive hostility was a man in genuine pain, not just physical, but existential. "I understand," she said quietly, "and I agree. Starting now, we focus on what you can do, not what you can't. You're still the same person, Mr. Reed. The same mind, the same drive. The body is just catching up. Something in her words seemed to reach him. He didn't smile or thank her, but some of the tension left his shoulders. "I have a call with Tokyo. In an hour, I need to prepare." Sarah recognized the dismissal. "I'll help you get set up in the bedroom when you're ready. Press the call button if you need anything before then." Over the next few days, a tentative routine emerged. Sarah was present but unobtrusive, providing assistance when needed, but giving Max space to maintain his business operations and privacy. She noticed that despite his claims of being fine, he often exhausted himself trying to maintain his pre-accident pace, refusing to acknowledge his body's new limitations. Eleanor called daily, but visited rarely. When she did come to the penthouse, she spoke more to Sarah about Max's care than to Max himself. The emotional disconnect between them was palpable, a silent acknowledgement that their relationship had been irreparably damaged by his accident. On the 5th day, Sarah arrived in the kitchen to find Max already there, attempting to make coffee one-handed, while balancing his wheelchair with the other. "I can do that," she offered, moving toward the expensive coffee machine. "I've been managing my own coffee for 30 years, Max snapped. "I don't need help with every basic task." Sarah stopped, recognizing the importance of this small assertion of independence. "All right, I'll start on breakfast then." She busied herself with preparing a protein-rich meal, pretending not to notice his struggles, but staying close enough to intervene if necessary. After several tense minutes, Max successfully placed a mug of coffee on the counter, a small victory that seemed to lift his mood considerably. "You're not what I expected," he admitted, watching her cook. "The others treated me like I was made of glass, or worse, like I wasn't there at all, talking about me as if I couldn't hear or understand." "That must have been frustrating," Sarah said, sliding a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. "People often don't know how to act around someone whose circumstances have changed dramatically. They forget that you're still you." Max studied her for a moment. "You speak from experience." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "My mother lost her sight when I was 12. People started treating her differently overnight, speaking loudly as if she were deaf, not blind, or addressing their questions to me instead of her. She hated it, taught me a lot about how not to treat people." "Your mother," she adjusted well. "Not at first," Sarah admitted. "There was anger, grief, the whole spectrum. But eventually she refused to let it define her. She learned to navigate the world differently, but she was still her, stubborn, brilliant, and determined to live life on her own terms." Max absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. "Is she still alive?" "No," Sarah said softly. "She passed away 3 years ago. Heart condition, unrelated to her blindness. But she lived fully right up until the end, taught high school history for 20 years after losing her sight." "She sounds remarkable," Max said with uncharacteristic gentleness. "She was," Sarah agreed, "and watching her taught me something important, that adaptation isn't surrender. It's just finding a different path to the same destination." Max didn't respond, but Sarah could see him processing her words. It was the most personal conversation they'd had, a small crack in the wall he'd built around himself. 3 weeks into Sarah's tenure as Max's caregiver, autumn painted Central Park in brilliant hues of red and gold, visible from the penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows. The morning light found them in the specially equipped exercise room, where Max was working through his rehabilitation exercises with a grim determination that had become familiar to Sarah. 10 more, she encouraged, monitoring his form as he performed upper body strengthening exercises. "Your endurance is improving." Max completed the set, his breathing heavy but controlled. "Not fast enough," he muttered, reaching for a towel to wipe the sweat from his face. "Recovery isn't linear," Sarah reminded him. "Some days will show more progress than others, but you're consistently improving week over week." Max's reply was cut short by the arrival of Eleanor, who entered the exercise room in a cloud of designer perfume, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of Max's sweat-soaked t-shirt and the intimate setting of the therapy session. "I didn't realize you had a session this morning," she said, her voice brittle. "I thought we could have breakfast together." "We're almost finished," Sarah said, professionally neutral as she began putting away equipment. "I'll leave you two alone." "No need," Eleanor replied quickly. "I have a meeting with the wedding planner at 10. I just wanted to check in." She turned to Max. "The benefit gala is next week. I've already told everyone you won't be attending, of course." Max's expression darkened. "Why would you do that without consulting me?" Eleanor looked genuinely surprised. "Darling, be reasonable. You're still recovering. The stairs alone at the Metropolitan—" "Have wheelchair access?" Max cut in. "As mandated by law." "Well, yes, but it would be easier for you if I stayed hidden away," Max finished. "Less explaining to do, less awkward conversations." Eleanor flushed. "That's not fair. I'm thinking of you. These events are exhausting even for people who aren't—" She stopped herself, but the unspoken word hung in the air between them. "Disabled," Max supplied flatly. "You can say it, Eleanor. It's not a dirty word." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Sarah cleared her throat. "I'll get Mr. Reed's protein shake ready in the kitchen," she said, making a tactful exit. But even from the kitchen, she could hear their voices rising. Eleanor's cultured tones growing higher with frustration, Max's deeper voice resonating with a bitter edge that had become all too familiar. "I don't recognize you anymore," Eleanor was saying. "You're so angry all the time, so determined to prove something." "To prove I'm still alive," Max retorted. "Still capable? Still the same man you agreed to marry?" "But you're not the same man," Eleanor said, her voice breaking slightly. "And I don't know how to reach you." There was a long silence, then the sound of Eleanor's heels clicking across the marble floor. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, composed but with telltale redness around her eyes. "Take care of him," she said to Sarah, her voice barely above a whisper. "He won't let me anymore." After Eleanor left, Sarah gave Max a few minutes alone before bringing him his post-workout shake. She found him by the windows, staring out at the park, his expression unreadable. "Beautiful view," she commented, setting the shake on the side table beside him. "It used to be," Max replied. "Now it just reminds me of all the places I can't go." Sarah folded her arms. "Can't or won't?" Max turned to her, surprise replacing melancholy. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Sarah said, her tone gentle but firm. "You've been out of this apartment exactly once in the 3 weeks I've been here, for a doctor's appointment. You've rejected every suggestion I've made about getting some fresh air or change of scenery." "I'm not interested in being a spectacle," Max said tightly, "or in navigating a world that wasn't built for this." He gestured to his wheelchair. "The world adapts," Sarah replied. "Not perfectly, not always easily, but it does. The question is whether you're willing to adapt with it." Max wheeled himself away from the window, his jaw set. "I have work to do." Running away from difficult conversations, is that the Maxwell Reed that conquered Wall Street? He stopped, his back to her. "You're overstepping, Ms. Mitchell." "Probably," she agreed, "but someone needs to. You're using work as a shield, hiding from a world you're afraid won't accept you as you are now." Max turned his chair slowly, his eyes flashing with anger. "You know nothing about me or my world." "I know more than you think," Sarah replied evenly. "I know that you check the business news every morning to see if your company's stock has dropped because of your condition. I know you've been avoiding video calls with your board members. I know you've had your assistant reschedule your quarterly investor meeting 3 times. Max's expression confirmed her observations. "My personal assistant talks too much," he muttered. "She's concerned about you," Sarah corrected, "as is your doctor, your physical therapist, and yes, even Eleanor in her own way." "Eleanor is concerned about how my condition reflects on her," Max said bitterly, "about how it complicates her perfect life narrative." "Perhaps," Sarah acknowledged, "but avoiding the world won't prove her wrong. It will only prove she was right to think you couldn't handle it." The challenge hung in the air between them. Max's eyes narrowed. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that you leave this gilded cage," Sarah said, gesturing to the penthouse. "Today, right now, start small. The park, a cafe, your office, anywhere that isn't these 4 walls." "And if I refuse?" Sarah shrugged. "Then nothing changes. You stay here, safe and comfortable and increasingly isolated. The choice is yours." Max studied her for a long moment, his expression inscrutable. Finally, he nodded once. "The park, 1 hour. But I'll need to change first." It was a small victory, but Sarah recognized it for the significant step it was. "I'll get everything ready." An hour later, they emerged from the Sovereign's private elevator into the lobby. Max was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit and overcoat, as if armor for the world beyond the building's doors. Sarah noticed how he sat straighter in his wheelchair, chin up, eyes forward, the posture of a man preparing for battle. The doorman hurried to open the door, his surprise at seeing Max quickly masked by professional courtesy. "Good morning, Mr. Reed. Pleasant day for a walk." "Indeed," Max replied curtly, propelling his wheelchair forward with practiced motions. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the distant aroma of street vendor pretzels. Central Park was just across the street, its pathways winding through the colorful foliage. "I can push if you'd like," Sarah offered, walking beside him. "I need to do this myself," Max replied, his focus on navigating the sidewalk. They waited. At the crosswalk, the pedestrians around them casting curious glances at the distinguished man in the wheelchair. Max pretended not to notice, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his jaw. Once in the park, the path opened up, and Max's movements became more fluid. The wheelchair rolled smoothly over the paved walkway, and gradually, Sarah saw him begin to relax, to take in the surroundings. The children playing, the elderly couples on benches, the joggers and dog walkers going about their day. "I used to run here," Max said suddenly. "Every morning at 5 a.m., 6 miles before most people were even awake." Sarah matched his pace beside him. "You miss it?" "Strangely, yes," he admitted. "I hated it at the time, the early alarm, the cold, mornings, the aching muscles. But there was something purifying about it, just me and the path and the rhythm of my footsteps." "There are adaptive sports programs," Sarah suggested. "Hand cycling, wheelchair racing." Max shook his head. "I'm not interested in adaptive anything. I don't want substitutes for my old life. I want my old life back." They continued in silence for a while, following the path deeper into the park. As they approached the Bethesda fountain, a small boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, stopped in his tracks to stare at Max. His mother tugged his hand, whispering an admonishment, but the boy broke free and ran up to Max's wheelchair. "Is that a race car?" he asked, eyes wide with fascination. Max looked startled, then bemused. "Not exactly," he replied. "Can it go fast?" the boy persisted. "Tommy!" his mother called, mortified as she hurried over. "I'm so sorry," she said to Max. "It's all right," Max assured her, surprising Sarah with his gentle tone. He turned back to the boy. "It can go pretty fast, but we have to be careful around other people." The boy nodded solemnly. "My cousin has a chair like that. He lets me ride on his lap sometimes, and we zoom." The mother looked ready to sink into the ground, but Max smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "That sounds like fun." "Tommy, we should let the nice man enjoy his walk," the mother said, gently steering her son away. "Say goodbye." "Bye, Mister," Tommy waved enthusiastically. "I hope you get to Zoom today." As they continued around the fountain, Sarah noticed that Max's posture had changed. The rigid defensiveness had softened, replaced by something more thoughtful. "Kids," she commented, "they see things differently, don't they?" "They haven't learned to pity yet," Max replied, "or to fear what's different." He paused, then added, "or to define people by their limitations." They found a quiet spot overlooking the lake, where the sun dappled the water through the trees. Max positioned his wheelchair beside a bench where Sarah sat. "When I was building Titan," he said suddenly, "everyone said it couldn't be done, that I was too young, too inexperienced, too ambitious. They were all waiting for me to fail." Sarah listened, sensing he needed to talk. "But their doubt fueled me," he continued. "Every no was a challenge. Every setback was data to learn from. I worked harder, pushed further, believed more strongly in my vision when no one else did. He turned to look at her. I've built my entire identity around overcoming obstacles, so why is this one breaking me? Because it's personal, Sarah said quietly. It's not a market force or a competitor or an economic trend. It's your body. There's no MBA program for this kind of challenge. Max absorbed her words, his eyes on the water. Eleanor wants to postpone the wedding. Sarah wasn't surprised. She told you this, not in so many words. But she stopped. Discussing dates, stopped including me in planning, just like she stopped seeing me as the man she agreed to marry. Have you talked to her about it? Max shook his head. What's the point? I've seen the way she looks at me now, like I'm a project she didn't sign up for, or worse, like I'm a stranger wearing her fiancé's face. Sarah chose her next words carefully. Sometimes people surprise us. They rise to challenges we didn't think they could meet, but they need to know what's being asked of them. Max looked at her sharply. Are you suggesting I should beg Eleanor to stay with me? That I should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention she's willing to give? No, Sarah said firmly. I'm suggesting that you deserve someone who sees you, all of you, not just the parts that fit into their perfect life plan, but you also need to be honest with yourself about what you need from a partner right now. What I need, Max said, slowly, is someone who doesn't see the wheelchair first, who remembers the man I was, the man I still am beneath all this. He gestured to his legs. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the boats on the lake. Max seemed lost in thought, processing their conversation. Finally, he checked his watch. We should head back. I have a video conference at noon. As they made their way back through the park, Sarah noticed that Max wheeled himself with more confidence, his eyes meeting those of passers-by rather than avoiding them. It was a small change but significant. Sarah, he said as they approached the street crossing, thank you. For what? For pushing me out the door, for talking straight to me, for... He paused, searching for the right words. For seeing me. The simple acknowledgement caught Sarah off guard. In that moment, she saw something shift in Maxwell Reed, a crack in the armor, a glimpse of the man behind the wealth and power and newly acquired defenses. You're welcome, she replied, simply. Same time tomorrow? For the first time since she'd known him, Max smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face. Maybe the Metropolitan Museum this time. I hear they have excellent wheelchair access. The days that followed marked a turning point. Max began venturing out regularly, first to the park, then to museums, and finally to his office at Titan Enterprises. Sarah accompanied him on these excursions, providing support when needed, but increasingly stepping back as Max regained his confidence in navigating the world. His first visit to the Titan offices caused a stir. Employees who had only communicated with him via email or phone since his accident tried to hide their shock at seeing him in a wheelchair. His executive assistant, a usually composed woman named Rebecca, had tears in her eyes when she greeted him. It's good to have you back. Sir, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Max held court in the boardroom, his wheelchair positioned at the head of the table. Sarah watched from the periphery as he commanded the room just as he had before the accident, his mind as sharp as ever. The initial awkwardness of his colleagues faded as the meeting progressed, replaced by the familiar rhythm of business discussion. On the way back to the penthouse, Max was uncharacteristically quiet. Everything okay? Sarah asked. Better than okay, he replied. I should have done this weeks ago, hiding away, as it wasn't just about my pride. It was about giving in to fear. Fear is natural, Sarah said. It's letting it control you that becomes the problem. Max nodded thoughtfully. My assistant told me something interesting today. Apparently, our stock actually went up when news broke that I was back at the office. The market likes stability. People respond to confidence, Sarah agreed, and seeing you in control, wheelchair or not, projects that confidence. When they arrived back at the penthouse, Eleanor was waiting. Her face registered surprise at seeing Max looking energized rather than exhausted. How was it? She asked cautiously. Productive, Max replied. The Singapore merger is proceeding ahead of schedule. Jenkins is going to send over the final projections later today. Eleanor's smile was strained. That's good. I meant, how was it for you, being back there? Max regarded her for a moment. It was where I needed to be, where I should have been all along. An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Sarah discreetly excused herself, but not before noticing the way Eleanor's gaze slid away from Max's, the way her body language suggested distance rather than intimacy. Later that evening, Sarah was preparing Max's evening medication when she heard raised voices from the living room. She tried not to listen, but the words carried. "You're not being realistic, Max," Eleanor was saying. "Yes, you had a good day at the office, but that doesn't mean everything can go back to normal. What about our life plans? Our travel itinerary? The skiing chalet in Aspen?" "Those plans can adapt," Max replied, his voice level but firm. "We can adapt." "Can we?" Eleanor's voice broke slightly. "I'm trying, Max, I really am. But this isn't what I signed up for." "What exactly did you sign up for, Eleanor?" Max's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. "The money, the status, the perfectly abled husband who would never inconvenience you with actual human needs." Sarah winced at the harshness of his words, but she couldn't entirely disagree with the sentiment behind them. "That's not fair," Eleanor protested, her voice rising. "You're twisting my words." "No, I'm hearing them clearly for the first time," Max replied. "Maybe it took me being at my lowest to see what was always there, or rather, what wasn't." There was a long silence, then the sound of Eleanor's heels clicking across the floor, followed by the ping of the elevator. Sarah waited a few minutes before entering the living room, where she found Max staring out at the city lights, his expression unreadable. "I heard raised voices," she said simply, setting his medication on the side table. "Eleanor and I had a disagreement," Max replied, not turning from the window. "About the future." Sarah nodded, not pressing for details. "Your medication is there when you're ready." As she turned to leave, Max spoke again. "She wants to postpone the wedding indefinitely, until I'm better." His voice was flat, emotionless. Sarah paused. "And what do you want?" Max turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the city lights. "I want someone who would marry me tomorrow, wheelchair and all, who sees this as a chapter in our story, not the end of it." The raw honesty in his voice stirred something in Sarah, a feeling she immediately tried to suppress. This was her patient, her client. His vulnerability was not an invitation. 2 months after Sarah had begun working with Max, winter had descended upon New York, transforming the city into a glittering landscape of lights and snow. The penthouse was warm against the December chill, the floor-to-ceiling, windows offering a panoramic view of Central Park, dusted with white. Max sat in the living room, reviewing contracts on his tablet, while Sarah prepared lunch in the kitchen. Their routine had settled into something comfortable, the initial tensions giving way to mutual respect and, increasingly, friendship. Max had made significant progress in both his physical rehabilitation and his emotional adjustment, embracing adaptive technologies and techniques that allowed him to reclaim much of his independence. The chime of the elevator announced Eleanor's arrival. Her visits had become less frequent since their argument, their relationship hanging in a painful limbo of unspoken decisions. She entered the living room in a flurry of designer clothing and perfume, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Max, darling," she greeted, bending to kiss his cheek. "You're looking well." "Eleanor," Max replied coolly, "this is unexpected." Eleanor removed her coat, revealing an elegant dress that clung to her model-thin frame. "I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd stop by to see how you're doing." Sarah appeared from the kitchen. "Good afternoon, Ms. Lawrence. Can I get you anything?" "No, thank you," Eleanor replied dismissively. "Max and I need to talk privately." Sarah caught Max's eye, receiving a subtle nod that it was okay for her to leave. "I'll be in my room if you need anything," she said, retreating to give them privacy. From her room, Sarah tried not to listen to their conversation, but the penthouse's open design carried voices easily. Eleanor's tone was animated, Max's responses measured. Something about a charity gala, a foundation board position, business connections. The conversation sounded rehearsed on Eleanor's part, as if she were performing a role rather than engaging in a genuine exchange. After 20 minutes, Sarah heard the elevator chime again, signaling Eleanor's departure. She waited a few moments before emerging, finding Max still in the living room, his expression troubled. "Everything okay?" she asked, resuming her preparation of their lunch. Max wheeled himself into the kitchen, positioning himself at the island counter. "Eleanor wants to reset our relationship," he said, making air quotes. "Start fresh," as she put it. Sarah raised an eyebrow as she sliced vegetables. "And what does that mean exactly?" "It means she's realized I'm not going to quietly fade away from public life," Max replied with a wry smile. "Titan's stock is up 15% since I returned to active management. The business press is calling it a remarkable comeback story. Being associated with me is fashionable again." "So she wants back in," Sarah observed, keeping her tone neutral despite the surge of protective anger she felt. "She wants what she's always wanted, the perfect power couple narrative," Max said, reaching for an apple from the fruit bowl. "The devoted fiancé supporting her man through adversity. It makes for good copy in the society pages." Sarah set down her knife, turning to face him fully. "And what do you want, Max?" He met her gaze steadily. "I want something real. Someone who was there when the cameras weren't watching and the stock was tanking. Someone who saw me at my worst and didn't look away." The unspoken implication hung in the air between them. Sarah broke eye contact first, returning to her task with deliberate focus. "Your physical therapy session is at 2, she reminded him, changing the subject. "Sarah," Max said quietly, "look at me." She did, reluctantly. His grey eyes were intense, searching. "You've been more than a caregiver to me," he continued. "You've been my anchor when I was adrift, my compass when I lost my way." "Max," Sarah cautioned, "I'm still your employee. There are professional boundaries." "I know," he interrupted, "and I respect that. But I also know that what's developing between us isn't just professional. At least not for me." Sarah took a deep breath. "Max, you're in a vulnerable position. It's common for patients to develop feelings for their caregivers. It's called transference." "Don't," Max said sharply. "Don't reduce what I feel to a psychological cliché. I ran a multi-billion-dollar company. I've negotiated deals that changed the face of industries. I know my own mind, Sarah." "I'm not questioning your mind," Sarah replied gently. "I'm questioning the timing. You're still processing the changes in your life, your relationship with Eleanor." "My relationship with Eleanor was over the moment she couldn't look me in the eye after the accident," Max cut in. "Maybe it was over before that and I just didn't see it. But that's not what this is about. This is about you and me and the connection we've formed." Sarah moved around the kitchen island, putting space between them. "I care about you, Max, I do, but this can't happen. Not while I'm your caregiver." Max's jaw tightened. "Then quit." "What?" "Quit," he repeated. "Resign as my caregiver. I'll hire someone else. I'm doing well enough now that I don't need round-the-clock care anyway." Sarah shook her head. "It's not that simple." "It can be," Max insisted. "You're afraid, Sarah. Afraid to admit that what's between us is real." "I'm trying to be professional," Sarah countered. "To do the right thing." "The right thing according to who?" Max challenged. "Some arbitrary code of ethics, or what your heart is telling you?" Sarah felt her defenses weakening. The truth was, she had been fighting her growing feelings for Max for weeks. His determination, his vulnerability, his gradual opening up to her. She had told herself it was inappropriate, unprofessional, potentially harmful to his recovery. But standing here, facing his unflinching honesty, those excuses felt hollow. "I need time," she finally said, "to think about this, to make sure it's right for both of us." Max nodded slowly. "Fair enough, but don't take too long. Life's too short for hesitation. I've learned that the hard way." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Max's physical therapist, a burly man named Dave who had been working with him since his return from the rehabilitation center. Sarah retreated to her room, grateful for the reprieve and the opportunity to sort through her conflicted emotions. That evening, as a light snow fell outside, Sarah sat in the living room reading while Max worked on his laptop. The silence between them was charged with unspoken feelings and unresolved tension. Finally, Max closed his computer and wheeled himself over to where she sat. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, "about what you said regarding your mother, how she refused to let her blindness define her." Sarah set down her book. "Yes? I've been letting my injury define me," Max admitted. "Even as I've tried to reclaim my old life, I've been seeing myself through the lens of what I lost. But what if—" He paused, searching for the right words. "What if this is just another beginning? A different path to the same destination, as you put it?" Sarah smiled softly. "That's a profound realization." "I had a good teacher," Max replied, "and I want to put it into practice. I've been thinking about starting a foundation, something to fund research into spinal cord injuries, but also to provide practical support for people who don't have the resources I do." "That sounds wonderful," Sarah said sincerely. "Your experience and business acumen could make a real difference." "Want you to help me," Max continued. "Not as my caregiver, but as a partner in this. Your medical knowledge, your experience, your perspective, they're invaluable." Sarah hesitated. "Max, if this is just another way to—" "It's not," he assured her. "This is something I want to do regardless of what happens between us personally. I've spent my life accumulating wealth and power. Now I want to use it for something meaningful." The sincerity in his voice convinced her. "I'd be honored to help." "Good," Max said with a satisfied nod. "We'll start planning tomorrow." As he turned to head toward his bedroom, he paused. "Oh, and Sarah? I felt something today, during physical therapy. When Dave was helping me with the standing frame, it was faint, but it was there. A tingling in my right thigh." Sarah's eyes widened. "Max, that could be significant. Did you tell Dave?" "Yes," Max confirmed. "He said not to get my hopes up, that it could be phantom sensation. But I know what I felt." The possibility of neurological recovery, however small, hung in the air between them like a fragile hope. Sarah approached him, kneeling beside his wheelchair to meet his eyes. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "whether it's a sign of recovery or not, you're going to be okay. Better than okay." Max reached out, his hand cupping her cheek in a gesture that crossed every professional boundary between them. "I know," he said simply. "Because of you." Sarah didn't pull away. Instead, she covered his hand with her own, acknowledging the connection between them that had grown too strong to deny. "We should talk to your doctor," she said. "Schedule additional tests." Max smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Always the professional, he teased gently. "But yes, we will. Tomorrow." That night, Sarah lay awake in her bed, her mind racing with possibilities. The potential for Max's neurological improvement was exciting professionally, but it was her personal feelings that kept her from sleep. She had crossed an invisible line today, admitting to herself what she had been denying for weeks, that she cared for Max as more than a patient. The night Sarah lay awake in her bed, her mind racing with possibilities. The potential for Max's neurological improvement was exciting professionally, but it was her personal feelings that kept her from sleep. She had crossed an invisible line today, admitting to herself what she had been denying for weeks, that she cared for Max as more than a patient. As she finally drifted toward sleep, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her former supervisor at the rehabilitation center, checking in on her. Sarah's fingers hovered over the screen as she considered her response. Finally, she typed, "Everything's changing, need advice, can we talk tomorrow?" The reply came quickly, "Of course, call me when you can." The following morning dawned bright and cold, sunlight reflecting off the fresh snow. Sarah found Max already in the kitchen, making coffee with a newfound dexterity that spoke to his progress. "I've scheduled an appointment with Dr. Harrington for this afternoon," he announced without preamble. "He can fit us in at 3. Sarah nodded, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "That's good. We shouldn't get ahead of ourselves, though. What you experienced, it could be many things." "I know," Max said, though his eyes shone with barely contained hope. But whatever it is, I want to understand it, to face it head on. During Max's morning therapy session, Sarah stepped out onto the penthouse terrace to make her call. The winter air bit at her cheeks as she explained the situation to Dr. Mitchell, her former supervisor. "You've developed feelings for your patient," Dr. Mitchell summarized, his voice neither judgmental nor surprised. "It happens, Sarah, more often than the profession likes to admit." "That doesn't make it right," Sarah countered. "There are ethical considerations, power dynamics." "True," he acknowledged, "but from what you've described, this isn't a vulnerable patient being taken advantage of. This is a man who knows his own mind, who's regaining his independence, who sees you as an equal rather than as his savior." "So, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that ethics aren't always black and white. That if you're serious about exploring a personal relationship, you need clear boundaries. You can't be his romantic partner and his caregiver. Those roles are fundamentally incompatible." Sarah watched her breath form clouds in the cold air. "He's asked me to help with a foundation he wants to start. As a professional colleague, not a caregiver, that could be a good transition," Dr. Mitchell suggested. "But you still need to be honest with yourself about what you want and what's best for both of you." After the call, Sarah returned to find Max finishing his therapy session, his face flushed with exertion, but eyes bright with accomplishment. "Dave says my upper body strength has increased 30% since we started," he reported proudly. "And he thinks the tingling sensation could be a positive sign, though he's being cautious about it." Sarah smiled. "That's great news. Are you ready for lunch before the doctor's appointment?" As they ate, Sarah broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "I spoke with my former supervisor this morning about us." Max looked up, giving her his full attention. "And?" "And I've made a decision," Sarah said, setting down her fork. "If you're serious about wanting to explore what's between us, I can't continue as your caregiver. It's not ethically sound, and it's not healthy for either of us." "I understand," Max said carefully. "And the foundation idea, working together professionally?" "That I can do," Sarah confirmed. "It's a boundary I'm comfortable with. I can help. You find a new caregiver, someone qualified who can continue supporting your rehabilitation." Max considered this, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. I respect your principles, Sarah. It's part of what I admire about you." He paused. "So what happens now?" "Now we go to your doctor's appointment," Sarah said with a small smile. "And after that, we take things one day at a time, see where this leads us." The appointment with Dr. Harrington was both encouraging and cautious. After a thorough examination and discussion of Max's symptoms, the doctor ordered additional tests, but warned against premature optimism. "Incomplete spinal cord injuries can be unpredictable," he explained. "What you're experiencing could be the beginning of some nerve regeneration, or it could be temporary sensory feedback that won't progress further. We need more data." Max took the news with a composure that impressed Sarah. The old Max might have demanded certainties, guarantees. This Max understood that some things couldn't be controlled or predicted, only faced with courage and patience. On the ride back to the penthouse, snowflakes began to fall again, coating the city in a fresh layer of white. The winter light was fading, the skyscrapers beginning to twinkle with thousands of windows illuminated against the darkening sky. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Max said, gazing out at the cityscape. "I never really stopped to look at it before. Too busy chasing the next deal, the next milestone." "And now?" Sarah asked. "Now I see beauty in moments I would have missed before," he replied, his eyes shifting from the window to her face. "In companionship, I wouldn't have valued." The car pulled up to the Sovereign, the doorman hurrying out with an umbrella to shield them from the falling snow. As they entered the lobby, the elevator attendant greeted them with a respectful nod. "Mr. Reed, this was delivered for you earlier," he said, handing Max an envelope. Max opened it as they rode up to the penthouse, his expression darkening as he read the contents. "It's from Eleanor," he said, passing it to Sarah. The note was brief but clear. Eleanor had been offered a position on the board of a major fashion conglomerate, a role that would require extensive international travel. She wouldn't be able to provide the support Max needed during this difficult time, and thought it best that they formalize the end of their engagement. She wished him well and hoped they could remain amicable colleagues. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked gently as they entered the penthouse. Max wheeled himself to the windows, looking out at the snow-covered city. "Strangely, yes," he said after a moment. "It feels honest, the first honest thing between us in months." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, meaning it, despite her complicated feelings about Eleanor. "Don't be," Max replied, turning to face her. "Some endings make room for better beginnings." His gaze held hers, the distance between them charged with possibility. Sarah felt herself drawn toward him, professional boundaries giving way to human connection. But before either could bridge the gap, the elevator chimed, announcing an unexpected visitor. The doors slid open to reveal a striking woman in her 60s, elegantly dressed, with Max's steel-grey eyes and commanding presence. "Mother," Max said, surprise evident in his voice. "This is unexpected. Apparently it's my week for unexpected visits," the woman replied dryly, striding into the penthouse with the confidence of someone accustomed to making an entrance. Her gaze settled on Sarah, assessing her with frank curiosity. "You must be the famous Sarah," she said. "I've heard quite a bit about you from Maxwell's assistant. I'm Victoria Reed." Sarah extended her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Reed." "Ms." Victoria corrected with a wry smile. "I've been divorced from Maxwell's father for longer than I was married to him." She turned to her son. "You're looking well, Maxwell. Better than the last time I saw you." "You mean at the hospital? When you flew in for exactly 6 hours before jetting off to Milan?" Max replied, his tone somewhere between affection and exasperation. Victoria shrugged elegantly. "I came, didn't I? More than your father did." She set down her handbag and removed her coat. "Now, I understand from Rebecca that you've had some medical news and that Eleanor has finally shown her true colors. I thought it might be time for a proper visit." Sarah moved toward the door. "I should give you privacy." "Nonsense," Victoria cut in. "I have a feeling you're at the center of both developments. Stay." Max caught Sarah's eye, silently asking if she was comfortable with this. When she nodded, he gestured for her to sit. "Mother, what exactly did Rebecca tell you? That you experienced some sensation in your legs, that it might be significant or it might not, that you've been seeing specialists, and that Eleanor delivered her Dear John letter today, choosing her career over standing by you." Victoria's direct manner was somewhat jarring, but Sarah could see where Max had inherited his forthrightness. "That about covers it," Max confirmed, "though I'd call it a mutual parting of ways rather than abandonment." Victoria snorted delicately. "Always diplomatic. A trait you certainly didn't get from me." She turned her penetrating gaze to Sarah. "And your role in all this?" Before Sarah could formulate a response, Max intervened. "Sarah has been instrumental in my recovery, physically and otherwise. She's helped me see myself as whole again, not defined by what happened to me." Victoria studied them both for a long moment, her expression softening. "I see," she said simply, but the knowing look in her eyes suggested she saw more than was being explicitly stated. "Well, I think this calls for a proper dinner. I've taken the liberty of making reservations at Daniel for 8 o'clock. I expect you both to join me." Spring arrived in New York with a gentle insistence, coaxing green buds from branches that had stood bare against the winter sky. Central Park transformed from monochrome stillness to vibrant life, a metaphor not lost on Max as he guided his wheelchair along a familiar path with Sarah walking beside him. "Hard to believe it's been 6 months, he remarked, pausing to watch a group of children flying kites on the great lawn. Sarah nodded, her auburn hair lifting in the breeze. 6 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days, to be exact. "You've been counting?" Max asked with a raised eyebrow. "Professional habit," Sarah replied with a smile. "Tracking progress is part of the job." Much had changed in those 6 months. After Sarah had officially resigned as Max's caregiver, their relationship had evolved cautiously, gradually deepening from professional respect to friendship, and finally to something more intimate and profound. Max had hired a part-time aide, a no-nonsense retired army medic named James, who assisted with his physical therapy and medical needs, maintaining the professional boundaries that Sarah had insisted upon. The Reed Foundation for Spinal Research and Rehabilitation had launched with significant fanfare 3 months earlier, with Max as chairman and Sarah as director of patient advocacy. Their combined expertise, his business acumen and her medical knowledge, had quickly established the foundation as a serious player in the field, attracting top researchers and substantial donations. "The gala is next week," Max reminded her, as they continued their leisurely path through the park. "You still haven't told me what you're wearing." "That's because I haven't decided yet," Sarah admitted. "I've never attended a black tie fundraiser before, let alone helped organize one." "Victoria offered to take you shopping," Max said, "an offer I strongly encourage you to accept. My mother has many faults, but lack of taste isn't one of them." Sarah laughed. "Your mother intimidates me." "She intimidates everyone," Max replied with affection. "It's her superpower. But she likes you, which puts you in a very exclusive club." The relationship between Sarah and Victoria Reed had been initially wary but had developed into mutual respect. Victoria, for all her formidable exterior, recognized in Sarah the substance and integrity her son needed, while Sarah appreciated the older woman's fierce loyalty to Max and her refusal to treat him differently after his accident. They reached Bethesda Fountain, the spot where months ago a young boy had innocently asked if Max's wheelchair could zoom. Max had requested they come here today, though he hadn't explained why. "Let's stop for a while," he suggested, positioning his chair beside a bench where Sarah sat. The afternoon sun dappled through new leaves, casting shifting patterns on the ground. People strolled by, couples holding hands, families with children, tourists taking photos of the angel statue above the fountain. Normal life continuing all around them, something that had once seemed impossible in the dark days. After Max's accident, "I had another breakthrough yesterday," Max said suddenly. "During physical therapy with James, he doesn't know yet. I wanted to tell you first." Sarah turned to him, alert. "What happened?" "Voluntary movement," Max said, his voice carefully controlled despite the magnitude of the news. "My right foot. Just a slight flexion, but definitely intentional. I tried again this morning and I could repeat it." Sarah's eyes widened, professional excitement mingling with personal joy. "Max, that's incredible. Consistent voluntary movement below the injury site. That's significant progress." The past months had brought gradual improvement in sensation, but minimal functional recovery. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic, but non-committal about Max's long-term prognosis. This development potentially shifted those expectations. "It may not lead to walking," Max cautioned, ever the realist. "Dr. Harrington has been clear about managing expectations." "Of course," Sarah agreed, "but any recovery of function is positive. This could improve your independence, your quality of life." Max reached for her hand, his expression serious. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. Quality of life. What makes a life worth living?" Sarah felt a flutter of anticipation. There had been a shift in Max over the past week, a quiet intensity, moments of distraction, private phone calls. She had sensed he was working towards something, but had given him space to find his way there. "When my accident first happened," Max continued, "I thought my life as I knew it was over. Everything I valued, my independence, my control, my identity, seemed lost. I measured my worth by what I could do, what I could achieve, what I could acquire." Sarah squeezed his hand encouragingly, but remained silent, letting him find his words. "Then you came into my life," he said, his grey eyes holding hers. "Not impressed by my wealth or status, not deterred by my anger or bitterness. You saw me, not the wheelchair, not the CEO, not the broken man, but me. You challenged me to redefine what matters, to find value in who I am, rather than what I can do." He released her hand briefly to reach into his jacket pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. Sarah's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a simple but elegant diamond ring. "I'm not asking because I need a caregiver or because I'm afraid to be alone," Max said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. "I'm asking because these months with you have been the most meaningful of my life. Because I want to share whatever comes next, good days and bad, triumphs and setbacks, with you by my side." He held the box toward her, vulnerability and strength equally present in his gaze. "Sarah Mitchell, will you marry me?" The moment stretched between them, charged with significance. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, not from surprise but from the rightness of it, the culmination of a journey neither of them could have anticipated. "Yes," she said simply, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I will." Max's face transformed, with joy as he took the ring from its box and slipped it onto her finger. Their hands entwined, a silent promise exchanged with the gesture. "I should warn you," Max said with a slight smile. "My mother has already started planning the wedding. She may have been slightly more confident of your answer than I was." Sarah laughed, wiping away happy tears. "Why am I not surprised? Do we get any say in this event?" "We can try," Max replied dubiously. "But Victoria Reed planning a society wedding is a force of nature best not directly opposed. Strategic negotiation is our only hope." As they shared this moment of lightness, a familiar voice called out, "Mr. Reed, Ms. Mitchell." They turned to see Tommy, the little boy from their first park visit, racing toward them, his mother following, at a more sedate pace. "I remember you," Tommy declared, coming to a stop beside Max's wheelchair. "You have the chair that goes zoom," Max chuckled. "I do indeed, and you've grown since I last saw you." Tommy nodded solemnly. "Mom says I'm growing like a weed. Do you remember my cousin Jake, the one who has a chair like yours? He got a new one that goes even faster." "That sounds exciting," Max replied, genuinely engaging with the child's enthusiasm. Tommy's mother caught up, slightly out of breath. "Tommy, you know better than to run off like that." She looked up at Max and Sarah, recognition dawning. "Oh, we met last fall, didn't we? At the fountain." "We did," Sarah confirmed warmly. "It's nice to see you both again." "Congratulations," the woman said, noticing the new ring on Sarah's finger. "I couldn't help but see. That's wonderful news." "Thank you," Max replied, his hand finding Sarah's again. "It's been quite a journey." After chatting for a few more minutes, Tommy and his mother continued on their way, the boy turning back to wave enthusiastically. Sarah and Max watched them go, both struck by the serendipity of the encounter. "Coming full circle," Sarah murmured, "in more ways than one." As they made their way back along the park paths, the conversation turned to practical matters when, to announce their engagement officially, how to navigate Victoria's wedding planning enthusiasm, and the implications for their work at the foundation. "I've been thinking about expanding our programs," Max said as they approached the park exit. "Adding a mentorship component that pairs newly injured patients with those further along in their recovery journey. Something that addresses the emotional and psychological aspects, not just the physical." "That's a wonderful idea," Sarah agreed. "The medical community tends to focus so much on the physical rehabilitation that the emotional adjustment gets sidelined. Having guides who've walked or wheeled that path could make all the difference." Max nodded. "Exactly. We could pilot it at New York Presbyterian and Ocean View, then scale based on the results." His eyes lit up with the familiar spark of purpose that Sarah had come to love, the innovator's mind constantly seeking ways to transform challenges into opportunities. Back at the penthouse, they found James finishing his shift, tidying the exercise equipment in the home gym. Max immediately shared the news of his breakthrough with his caregiver, who responded with professional enthusiasm and genuine delight. "That's significant progress, sir," James said, immediately documenting the development in Max's medical log. "We should adjust tomorrow's session to explore this further." After James departed, Max and Sarah settled in the living room, the evening light casting a golden glow over the space that had evolved from a sterile showcase to a genuine home over the months. Photos now adorned the walls, Max with his mother at the foundation launch, Sarah with her young niece on a visit to the zoo, the two of them together at a benefit concert. "I need to call my sister," Sarah said, glancing at her ring. She's going to be thrilled. She's been asking when you were going to make an honest woman of me for months now. Your sister has always seen right through me, Max said with affection. He had formed a quick bond with Sarah's younger sister Lily, who shared Sarah's straightforward manner, but paired it with an irreverent sense of humor that often caught Max off guard. As Sarah made the call, Max wheeled himself to the window, looking out at the city bathed in sunset light. From this vantage point, he could see the towering Titan Enterprises headquarters, the Empire State Building, and the distant shimmer of the Hudson River, the landscape of his former life now viewed through new eyes. His gaze shifted to Sarah, animated as she shared their news with her sister. 6 months ago, he couldn't have imagined this future, finding joy not despite his injury, but somehow because of the path it had set him on. The accident that had seemed like an ending had somehow become a beginning. Later that evening, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of the bedroom, Sarah's head resting on his shoulder, Max voiced the thought that had been forming within him throughout the day. "I've been thinking about what true healing means," he said softly. "Before the accident, I was whole physically, but incomplete in every other way. I filled my life with acquisitions and achievements, thinking they were the measure of success." Sarah listened, her hand resting over his heart. "Then everything changed in an instant," he continued, "and through that loss I found something I never knew I was missing. Connection, purpose beyond profit, the courage to be vulnerable." "That's a profound kind of healing," Sarah murmured. "You were the catalyst," Max said, stroking her hair. "You saw the man I could be when I could only see what I'd lost." Sarah raised herself on her elbow to look into his eyes. "We healed each other. Before you, I was all about the work, keeping emotional distance from my patients, defining myself by my professional identity. You challenged me to cross that line, to risk my heart." Max pulled her closer, the warmth of her body against his, a reminder of how far they'd both come. "Whatever happens with my recovery, whether I regain more function or not, I want you to know that I'm at peace with it. I've found something worth more than walking." "We'll face whatever comes together," Sarah promised, "one step at a time." The phrase, once a clinical rehabilitation mantra, had become their personal philosophy, a reminder that life's journey unfolds gradually, that progress isn't always linear, that each moment carries its own value, regardless of the destination. 1 year later, on a perfect May afternoon, Maxwell Reed waited beneath a flower-adorned gazebo in the garden of his mother's Hamptons estate. Custom standing braces and forearm crutches allowed him to stand for this moment, the culmination of months of intensive therapy following the gradual return of function in his legs. Though he would likely always need the wheelchair for distance and endurance, the ability to stand for his wedding day had become a personal goal that he had pursued with characteristic determination. Beside him stood Dave, his physical therapist, turned friend, serving as best man. In the front row, Victoria Reed watched with uncharacteristic tears in her eyes, while Tommy and his cousin Jake, now treasured family friends, served as ring bearers. When Sarah appeared at the end of the garden path, escorted by her brother-in-law, a hush fell over the gathered guests. She walked slowly toward him, radiant in a simple gown that caught the light with each step. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, Max knew with absolute certainty that the journey, with all its pain and discovery, setbacks and triumphs, had led exactly where it was meant to. As Sarah reached him, taking both his hands in hers, Max stood steady on his own strength and the foundation of their love, broken but healed, changed but whole, ready to begin the next chapter of their unexpected story together. Fim da história. Queridos ouvintes, esperamos que a história de Max e Sarah tenha tocado seus corações. Lembrete de que, às vezes, as maiores bênçãos surgem dos momentos mais desafiadores da vida. Se esta jornada de superação e amor verdadeiro ressoou com você, não esqueça de se inscrever em nosso canal para mais histórias que exploram a profundidade da experiência humana. Deixe seu like para nos ajudar a alcançar mais pessoas com narrativas que inspiram e transformam. E nos conte nos comentários: você já testemunhou ou viveu uma história de superação e amor que mudou sua perspectiva sobre a vida. Estamos ansiosos para ler suas próprias histórias, enquanto preparamos novos conteúdos que continuarão a explorar as complexidades e belezas do coração humano.